What if I told you the Secret Service kept a logbook that accidentally told the truth about every president since Truman? After JFK's assassination in 1963, new protocols mandated code names for all protectees, supposedly random selections for radio clarity. But the names revealed something else entirely: ego, insecurity, and who actually understood power. Reagan playing cowboy. The Bushes building dynasty. Obama choosing rebellion. Trump insisting on branding. If you love forgotten political psychology, hit subscribe. You'll want the rest of this series. Get comfortable. Pour something warm. Settle in for the night. The Secret Service didn't plan to create a psychological archive when they began experimenting with code names in the years after World War II. They were solving a technical problem that had become increasingly urgent as radio communications expanded presidential protection operations. Anyone with basic equipment could intercept Secret Service transmissions, potentially learning the president's exact location, schedule, and security arrangements. By 1945, as Harry Truman settled into an office he'd never expected to occupy after Franklin Roosevelt's sudden death, the service started testing code words to obscure their protectee's identity over open channels. Truman's assigned code name was Supervise, though service records indicate the system remained informal and inconsistent throughout his presidency. According to documentation preserved in the National Archives, Truman never used the designation himself and didn't particularly care whether agents employed it during radio communications. The man who'd been a haberdasher, an artillery captain in World War I, a county judge, and a relatively obscure senator before Roosevelt selected him as running mate, wasn't especially interested in the theatrical elements of presidential protection. He walked where he wanted, greeted strangers on Pennsylvania Avenue, and treated the Secret Service detail as polite but largely unnecessary company. The code name sat in a file somewhere, functional and forgotten, rarely enforced by agents who were still developing protection protocols that wouldn't be standardized for another 2 decades. When Truman famously took his early morning walks through Washington, often accompanied by a single agent scrambling to keep up, Supervise appeared sporadically, if at all, in whatever radio communications occurred. The informality reflected broader attitudes about presidential security during this era. Protection was considered important, but not paramount. Presidents were expected to be accessible, to maintain connection with ordinary citizens, to avoid the kind of imperial isolation that might separate them from democratic accountability. Truman embodied this approach, treating Secret Service protection as mild inconvenience rather than operational necessity. Yet Supervise carried accidental weight that became apparent in retrospect. The words suggested oversight, management, control, and administrative authority, qualities Truman demonstrated throughout his unexpected presidency. He'd supervised the end of World War II, making the decision to use atomic weapons against Japan. He'd supervised the Marshall Plan's reconstruction of Europe, containing Soviet expansion through economic rather than military means. He'd supervised the desegregation of the military, issuing Executive Order 9981 despite fierce opposition from Southern Democrats. Whether the agents selecting the name recognized this symbolic fit or stumbled into it by pure chance, the sparse documentation from this period doesn't clarify. What's documented is Truman's profound indifference to his code name and to the entire protective apparatus surrounding him. Service archives from 1945 through 1953 show minimal radio discipline around code names, with agents frequently speaking Truman's actual name over open channels. The system existed more as bureaucratic suggestion than operational requirement. Protection details operated primarily on physical proximity and reaction speed, not on the kind of sophisticated communication security that code names were theoretically designed to provide. This casual approach would seem not just quaint, but criminally negligent after Dallas. Once Kennedy died in public and the Secret Service's failures became national trauma, every informal protocol from the Truman era would be scrutinized and systematically replaced with mandatory procedures that left nothing to individual agent discretion. Code names would shift from occasional courtesy to absolute requirement, from optional designation to permanent identity preserved in central registries. But in the late 1940s and early 1950s, supervised remained what Truman treated it as administrative background noise barely worth acknowledging. He had genuinely overwhelming concerns that made codenames seem trivial by comparison. The Soviet Union was testing atomic weapons, eliminating America's nuclear monopoly. The Korean War was consuming American lives in a conflict that couldn't be won and couldn't be abandoned. McCarthyism was creating domestic paranoia that threatened civil liberties. A codename assigned by agents he barely knew ranked somewhere below choosing what to eat for lunch. The service's logbook entry for Truman, created retroactively after the 1963 protocols formalized everything, and agents attempted to document historical precedents, shows supervised with notation, rarely used by protectee. No objection to designation. No alternate requested. System informal during this period. That bureaucratic language captured Truman's entire relationship with presidential theater. He'd do the job, make the decisions that needed making, take responsibility for consequences, and ignore the performance aspects whenever possible. Years later, historians examining the early logbook entries and attempting to trace the evolution of Secret Service code name protocols would note the irony that Truman's designation contained. He had indeed supervised the creation of the modern presidency, establishing patterns of executive authority that would persist through subsequent administrations. His decision to use atomic weapons, to contain Soviet expansion, to desegregate the military, to fire General Douglas MacArthur during the Korean War, these supervisory decisions shaped American power for decades. His codename had accidentally predicted his legacy, capturing in one word the administrative competence and willingness to make hard decisions that defined his presidency. But Truman himself never cared enough about the designation to recognize or comment on the fit. He left office in January 1953 with supervised barely documented, returning to Independence, Missouri to live out his retirement in the modest home he'd occupied before politics elevated him to power he'd never sought. The system was being built during Truman's years, though nobody involved fully understood what they were creating. The archive was starting to accumulate entries that would eventually document something far beyond operational security. And Truman, characteristically, had more important things to do than think about what the Secret Service occasionally called him over radio frequencies he never monitored and didn't particularly care about. Dwight Eisenhower arrived in January 1953 with fundamentally different expectations about security, protocol, and the operational discipline required for effective presidential protection. A five-star general who'd commanded Allied forces across Europe during World War II, orchestrating the D-Day invasion and managing coalition warfare across multiple nations, he understood operational security in ways Truman hadn't needed to master. The service assigned him Providence, a choice that reflected both religious undertones appropriate to Eisenhower's mainstream Protestant faith and the broader sense that his presidency represented fortunate timing for a nation exhausted by Truman's controversies and seeking reassuring stability. Eisenhower accepted the codename Protocol without complaint or extended discussion. He'd spent decades following military procedures that often made less sense than this relatively straightforward requirement. Radio discipline, code names, operational security through standardized communications, these were familiar concepts from warfare, now applied to civilian protection in ways that seemed entirely reasonable to someone with his background. The Secret Service appreciated working for a president who instinctively understood why these protocols mattered and who didn't treat security measures as personal inconvenience. Providence carried symbolic weight that service agents may or may not have consciously intended when selecting the designation. The word suggested divine favor, destiny, careful guidance, and the quiet confidence of someone who'd already proven himself under unimaginable pressure. Whether the selection committee recognized they were creating this particular psychological portrait, or simply picked something that sounded appropriately dignified, and presidential remains unclear from the sparse documentation. What's clear from service records is that Eisenhower's detail used the code name consistently, and that agents found the entire protocol easier to enforce with someone who respected military-style discipline. The name also perfectly reflected public perception of Eisenhower in 1953. He embodied American providence in the most literal sense. A war hero who'd saved Europe from Nazi domination now arrived to save domestic politics from Truman's controversies, the Korean War stalemate, and democratic fatigue after 20 years of uninterrupted control. His election felt inevitable, preordained, almost providential. The codename echoed what the nation desperately wanted to believe about the general they'd elevated to the presidency. Service records from the Eisenhower years show measurably improved radio discipline compared to the informal Truman era. Agents used Providence routinely during presidential movements, and Eisenhower's actual name appeared less frequently in communications that could be intercepted by anyone with appropriate equipment. This improvement stemmed partly from Eisenhower's military background, making him naturally supportive of standardized procedures, and partly from technological advances that made radio encryption more feasible and reliable. But the system remained fundamentally informal throughout Eisenhower's 2 terms. Codenames were encouraged, increasingly normalized, but not yet mandatory. Some agents used them consistently. Others didn't bother unless specifically reminded by supervisors. The president's location was still announced openly over radio much of the time. If someone wanted to intercept Secret Service communications and determine presidential whereabouts, codenames provided only minimal obstruction. The system existed more as evolving best practice than as ironclad operational requirement that would be enforced regardless of circumstances. Eisenhower's 8 years established patterns that would matter tremendously after Dallas, though nobody at the time understood they were creating lasting institutional templates. His acceptance of Providence without requesting alternatives set precedent for presidential deference to service naming conventions. His comfort with military-style protocols normalized radio discipline that would become absolutely mandatory once Kennedy's assassination proved how catastrophically inadequate informal procedures had been. His administration created the foundation for modern presidential protection, even though contemporary agents were simply doing their jobs without realizing they were establishing procedures that would persist for decades. The codename also aged in interesting ways as Eisenhower's presidency unfolded and historians began examining his record with more critical perspective. During his time in office, Providence seemed entirely appropriate, a steady hand guiding America through Cold War tensions, overseeing interstate highway construction that transformed the nation's infrastructure, managing civil rights conflicts with cautious deliberation that sought to avoid explosive confrontation. He was the reassuring grandfather figure, providentially placed in power precisely when the nation needed calm rather than drama. But later historical analysis revealed a more complicated figure operating behind that grandfatherly facade. Eisenhower had relied heavily on covert CIA operations to overthrow governments in Iran and Guatemala, establishing patterns of intervention that would haunt American foreign policy for generations. He'd hesitated on civil rights, moving slowly and reluctantly on desegregation despite moral urgency that demanded faster action. He'd warned against the military-industrial complex in his farewell address, but had presided over the creation and expansion of that very complex throughout his presidency. Providence became ambiguous in retrospect, a name that asked uncomfortable questions. Had divine favor really guided Eisenhower's choices? Or had the designation simply reflected what Americans wanted to believe about their grandfatherly president? The logbook didn't answer these questions or provide interpretive framework. It simply preserved the designation as bureaucratic fact, waiting for future generations to analyze what Providence had actually meant during 8 years of governance that looked different depending on perspective and historical distance. When Eisenhower left office in January 1961, handing power to the young, energetic John F. Kennedy, Providence shifted to permanent archive status. Former presidents retained their codenames for life under emerging service regulations, meaning Eisenhower would be Providence until his death in March 1969. The name that had once suggested destiny and divine guidance became instead a marker of completed service. 8 years when Americans had believed their president was guided by something larger than ordinary politics, followed by retirement and eventual death that ended whatever providence the designation had implied. The logbook entry for Eisenhower documented the transition from informal to increasingly standardized codename usage, from casual acceptance to genuine operational discipline. His presidency represented the middle phase of system evolution, no longer the chaos of Truman's informal approach, not yet the mandatory rigor that would follow Kennedy's assassination. Providence sat in the archive as evidence of a president who'd accepted security protocols without resistance, and thereby helped normalize practices that would soon become absolute requirements rather than suggestions. The service continued refining their procedures throughout Eisenhower's 2 terms, learning from experience, adjusting protocols, training agents in communications discipline that would matter more than anyone understood until Dallas proved how much was at stake. The codename system was maturing, evolving from interesting experiment into genuine operational necessity, and Providence, whatever it meant symbolically, served its functional purpose, allowing agents to coordinate presidential protection without announcing their protectee's identity to anyone listening to radio frequencies that remained vulnerable to interception. John F. Kennedy received Lancer when he took office in January 1961, and the codename immediately evoked medieval chivalry, Camelot imagery, and the youthful vigor that Kennedy's campaign had emphasized as deliberate contrast to Eisenhower's grandfatherly stability. Whether the service intentionally referenced the Arthurian legends that would later define popular memory of Kennedy's presidency, or whether journalists and historians applied that interpretation retroactively after his assassination made the Camelot metaphor irresistible. The documentation doesn't definitively specify. What's preserved in service archives is that Kennedy accepted Lancer without objection, treating the code name as one more interesting quirk of presidential life, rather than as symbolic statement requiring careful consideration. Kennedy seemed genuinely amused by the designation according to agents who served on his detail and later provided oral histories. He occasionally joked about whether his code name made him sound sufficiently heroic, whether Lancer suggested the kind of bold leadership he wanted to project as the youngest elected president taking office at the height of Cold War tensions. The name fit his carefully constructed public image. Young, energetic, charging forward into a new decade with confidence that America's best days lay ahead rather than behind. His family received the L prefix according to protocols that were becoming increasingly standardized. Jackie became Lace, a designation emphasizing femininity, elegance, and the cultural sophistication she brought to a White House that would host Pablo Casal's concerts and become center of American artistic patronage. Caroline was lyric, suggesting childhood innocence and poetic grace. John Jr., born just weeks after the election, received Lark, a name evoking carefree flight and the innocence of youth. Together, these designations painted portrait of an American royal family, young and beautiful and representing the nation's idealized vision of itself. The service files from 1961 through November 1963 show improved but still inconsistent radio discipline around codename usage. Agents used Lancer routinely during presidential movements, but the system remained somewhat informal, with enforcement varying between different protection details and depending on circumstances. Kennedy's personal approach to security made consistent protection extraordinarily difficult. He hated the restrictions that safety imposed, wanted to wade into crowds and shake every available hand, treated assassination threats as paranoid overreaction unworthy of serious attention. This tension between presidential preference and security necessity would end catastrophically in Dallas. Service agents struggled throughout Kennedy's presidency to balance his desire for public accessibility with their responsibility to keep him alive. Lancer appeared in radio traffic coordinating movements through environments that agents considered dangerously exposed. During motorcades where Kennedy insisted on open convertibles despite obvious vulnerability. through crowds that pressed too close while the president actively encouraged intimacy that made protection nearly impossible. The codename took on entirely different meaning after November 22, 1963, when shots rang out in Dealey Plaza and Kennedy slumped in the back of the Lincoln Continental. When Clint Hill climbed onto the trunk and pushed Jackie back into her seat, when the motorcade raced to Parkland Hospital where doctors would pronounce the president dead, Lancer became forever associated with the Secret Service's most devastating failure. The designation appeared in radio traffic during those terrible minutes, agents using Kennedy's codename while he bled out, while the protection they'd sworn to provide collapsed into chaos and horror. The Warren Commission's investigation of the assassination would identify dozens of security lapses, many involving communications protocols that hadn't been adequately enforced. Radio traffic had been vulnerable to interception. Code names had been used inconsistently. Agents had been positioned poorly. The entire presidential protection apparatus had proven catastrophically inadequate for preventing a reasonably competent marksman from killing the president in public view. Lancer became shorthand not just for Kennedy, but for this institutional failure, for the service's inability to fulfill its core mission. News coverage of the assassination and its aftermath frequently mentioned Kennedy's code name, often in ways that emphasized the bitter irony. The young president, who'd been called Lancer, suggesting knightly valor and chivalric protection, had been shot while riding exposed in a motorcade through a city where threats had been documented but not adequately addressed. The name that was supposed to protect him by obscuring his identity over radio had failed to prevent his murder. Lancer became memorial rather than protection, historical artifact rather than operational designation. The service began drafting completely revised protocols before Kennedy's funeral ended. By late November, as Lyndon Johnson was sworn in aboard Air Force One and the nation struggled to process trauma that felt unsurvivable, service headquarters was mandating universal codename usage that would admit no exceptions. The informal system that had existed under Truman improved somewhat under Eisenhower and remained inconsistent under Kennedy would be replaced by absolute requirements backed by institutional authority that wouldn't tolerate deviation. The revised protocols appeared in Secret Service manuals dated December 1963. Codenames will be assigned to all protectees and used in all radio communications, without exception. The language was direct, unambiguous, designed to prevent exactly the kind of inconsistent enforcement that had characterized the Kennedy era. The service, bloodied by Dallas and desperate to demonstrate renewed competence, seized on standardization as proof that they'd learned from catastrophic failure and rebuilt protection procedures from foundation. Lancer remained in the permanent archives as a reminder of what happened when security protocols weren't enforced with absolute consistency. The name that had once evoked youthful confidence and Camelot mythology became forever associated with tragedy, institutional failure, and the moment American presidential protection transformed from polite accompaniment into obsessive vigilance that would never again tolerate presidential. Resistance to necessary security measures. The logbook preserved Lancer alongside documentation of the system's evolution from informal suggestion to mandatory requirement. Kennedy's presidency represented the breaking point, the moment when casual approaches to presidential security proved inadequately fatal. His codename sat in the archives as evidence that good intentions, improved procedures, and general competence weren't sufficient. Only absolute discipline, mandatory enforcement, and zero tolerance for exceptions could prevent another Dallas. Jackie Kennedy would later cultivate the Camelot metaphor, comparing her husband's brief presidency to King Arthur's shining moment before tragedy and betrayal. Lancer fit perfectly into this mythology. The young knight cut down before his quest could be completed. The promise of heroic leadership destroyed by violence that seemed to prove American society's corruption. Whether this interpretation dignified Kennedy's actual presidency or obscured more complicated reality, the codename provided linguistic foundation for the myth. The service never forgot what Lancer meant institutionally. Every agent trained after 1963 learned Kennedy's codename as part of learning why protection protocols existed, why radio discipline mattered, why presidents didn't get to override security measures just because they found restrictions inconvenient. Lancer became teaching tool, permanent reminder that the service's mission wasn't to accommodate presidential preferences, but to keep protectees alive regardless of their cooperation. The logbook entry for Kennedy documented both his brief presidency and the transformation his assassination triggered. Lancer sat at the hinge point between informal and mandatory, between suggestion and absolute requirement, between protection as courtesy and protection as obsession. Before Dallas, code names were interesting procedural detail. After Dallas, they were foundational element of a security apparatus rebuilt to ensure that what happened to Lancer would never happen again. Lyndon Johnson didn't wait for the Secret Service to assign him anything. In the chaotic weeks after Dallas, as he navigated the impossible task of continuing Kennedy's government while the nation mourned in collective shock, Johnson made it absolutely clear he wanted direct control over his codename selection. Service memos from December 1963, preserved in the National Archives and later obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, note his insistence on volunteer, a choice that reflected both his carefully cultivated political self-image and his acute psychological need to control every detail of his unexpected ascension to power through the trauma of assassination. The selection process itself revealed Johnson's sophisticated understanding of historical narrative and the symbolic architecture of political identity. According to service documentation, he considered several alternatives during transition meetings at the Executive Office Building, where he'd temporarily established presidential operations while Jackie Kennedy remained in the White House, fulfilling her role as grieving widow. Johnson understood instinctively that code names, while officially functional security measures designed to obscure protectee identity over vulnerable radio frequencies, carried symbolic weight that would be analyzed by historians, journalists, and political opponents for decades to come. Volunteer was either strategic genius or profound self-deception, depending on whether you believe Johnson's mythology about his own motivations. The name suggested selfless service, democratic ideals calling worthy citizens to leadership, willing sacrifice in the national interest, and a man who'd stepped forward when history demanded, rather than someone who'd maneuvered himself into position as Kennedy's running mate through backroom political dealing at the 1960 Democratic Convention. It was exactly the kind of designation someone picks after thinking very carefully about how it will sound when historians write about them 50 years later, when the chaos and contingency of November 1963 has been reduced to clean narrative arc. The service approved his selection without objection or significant deliberation. They'd learned from Dallas that fighting presidents on small preferences created friction that mattered far more than the preferences themselves, especially with someone as volatile and domineering as Johnson. If he wanted to be called volunteer over Secret Service radio frequencies, that was perfectly acceptable. The agents had vastly more important concerns, like preventing another president from dying in public, like rebuilding protection protocols that had failed catastrophically in Dealey Plaza, like implementing the mandatory codename system that would prevent future security lapses. Johnson used volunteer throughout his presidency with evident psychological satisfaction. Service records indicate he seemed genuinely pleased when he overheard the designation during motorcade movements or building entries, as if the name validated something essential about his relationship to the office he'd inherited through tragedy rather than electoral mandate. Multiple agents who served on his detail reported in later oral histories that Johnson would occasionally reference his code name in conversation, particularly when discussing his decision to escalate American involvement in Vietnam or his determination to pass Great Society legislation that Kennedy had been unable to achieve. This psychological dynamic, the gap between chosen identity and actual circumstance, would define Johnson's entire presidency and give volunteer increasingly ironic resonance as his time in office unfolded. He hadn't been elected in November 1963. He'd become president because someone shot Kennedy in Dallas. The designation allowed him to reframe that inheritance as willing service rather than opportunistic elevation, as democratic calling rather than the brutal accident of political violence. Whether Johnson consciously understood this psychological sleight of hand or simply responded instinctively to the emotional architecture of the word, the service files don't specify. His family members received code names following the emerging protocol of strict alphabetical matching. Lady Bird Johnson became Victoria, a designation suggesting both victory and the Victorian propriety she projected during public appearances, carefully cultivating an image of Southern grace and traditional values that provided ballast for her husband's often crude and domineering public persona. Their daughters Linda and Lucci received Velvet and Venus, names emphasizing femininity, luxury, and traditional gender roles entirely appropriate to 1960s expectations about presidential families and women's proper place within them. Each designation existed within Johnson's alphabetical shadow, marked by the V prefix that identified them as extensions of his presidential authority rather than independent political actors. This pattern, family members grouped under the president's initial, became absolute standard policy after Dallas. Service documentation from January 1964 shows explicit reasoning behind the alphabetical matching requirement that would be enforced without exception for subsequent administrations. Agents needed to identify family relationships instantly during radio communications, especially during complex movements involving multiple protectees traveling in separate motorcades or occupying different locations simultaneously. But the system also embedded family power dynamics into permanent bureaucratic record in ways the service hadn't fully considered during those frantic weeks after the assassination when everything about presidential protection was being rebuilt from scratch. The V names marked Lady Bird and her daughters as satellites orbiting Johnson's gravitational pull, which accurately reflected both 1960s cultural norms about women's subordinate roles and Johnson's notoriously domineering personality that extended absolute control over every aspect of his political operation, including his family's public presentation. Johnson's presidency began with extraordinary legislative success that seemed to validate the volunteer designation. In the months following Kennedy's death, he pushed through the Civil Rights Act of 1964, despite fierce Southern Democratic opposition, launched the War on Poverty with programs designed to eliminate economic deprivation from American society, and began constructing the Great Society vision that would expand federal government's role in American life more significantly than any domestic agenda since Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Volunteer appeared in service radio traffic during these triumphs, protecting the president as he signed historic legislation, coordinating his movements during whistle-stop campaign tours, tracking him through the massive 1964 election victory that finally gave him democratic legitimacy rather than inherited authority. But Vietnam transformed everything about Johnson's presidency and gave volunteer meanings its selector hadn't anticipated. By 1965, as Johnson systematically escalated American military involvement in Southeast Asia, committing ground combat troops and beginning sustained bombing campaigns against North Vietnam, the word volunteer acquired darker and more ironic resonances. Young American men were being drafted, not volunteering, to fight in rice paddies and jungles thousands of miles from home, in a conflict whose strategic purpose became less clear with each passing month and each rising casualty count. The contrast between Johnson's chosen codename and the involuntary military service he was demanding from hundreds of thousands of American citizens became increasingly uncomfortable and politically explosive. Service agents using volunteer over radio during this period were documenting a president whose decisions were creating actual volunteers for anti-war protests, alongside actual draftees who had no choice about serving in an increasingly unpopular war that seemed unwinnable through any strategy Johnson's administration could devise. The codename that had seemed appropriate in late 1963, when Johnson was framing himself as someone called to service by national tragedy, now echoed ironically through streets filled with anti-war protesters chanting against the president who'd volunteered them for slaughter without their consent. And without convincing justification for the sacrifice, demanded. The logbook entries from 1967 and 1968 show Volunteer appearing in increasingly tense circumstances as the service coordinated Johnson's movements through a White House besieged by demonstrators, tracked him to military bases where he visited wounded soldiers and delivered speeches about sacrifice. That rang hollow to growing numbers of Americans. They protected him during the chaotic 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, where police beat protesters in streets, while Johnson's chosen successor, Hubert Humphrey, accepted a nomination that would lead to electoral defeat against Richard Nixon. The service documentation from this period reveals the extraordinary security challenges involved in protecting a president who'd become so unpopular that public appearances required massive protective perimeters and careful advance work to prevent confrontations that might escalate into violence. By March 1968, when Johnson announced during a televised address from the Oval Office that he wouldn't seek re-election, volunteer had acquired its final bitter meaning. He was volunteering to leave, stepping aside because the nation had rejected his leadership in his war, because continuing would likely result in humiliating primary defeat or general election loss that would compound the failure Vietnam represented. The codename he'd selected with such care in late 1963, intending to frame his unexpected presidency as willing service to democratic ideals, had aged into a description of his forced exit from power. The service documentation from Johnson's final months in office shows volunteer used with the same professional consistency as always. Agents maintaining radio discipline regardless of political circumstances or presidential popularity. They didn't editorialize about irony or point out symbolic contradictions. They simply coordinated movements, tracked locations, maintained the operational security that kept the president's exact position obscure to anyone intercepting their communications. The codename persisted through Johnson's last days in office, through the January 1969 inauguration of Richard Nixon, through Johnson's retirement to his Texas ranch, where he would die just 4 years later. Johnson died in January 1973, suffering a heart attack at his ranch just days before the Paris Peace Accords officially ended American involvement in the Vietnam War he'd escalated. Volunteer remained his Secret Service designation until the end, preserved in the logbook alongside documentation of a presidency that had achieved extraordinary domestic reform while destroying itself through foreign policy catastrophe that consumed 58,000 American lives and fractured the Democratic coalition that had dominated American politics since the New Deal. The name documented both his aspiration and his failure, both his chosen identity as willing servant of democratic ideals and the reality that contradicted that self-image through systematic escalation of an unwinnable war. The service preserved volunteer in the permanent archive as the first codename selected under the mandatory post-assassination system, establishing precedent that presidents could request their designations while the service retained authority to reject choices that created operational problems. Richard Nixon arrived in January 1969 with a service-assigned codename he hadn't requested and apparently hadn't thought deeply about before accepting. Searchlight emphasized vigilance, illumination, and the relentless pursuit of clarity through darkness. Whether the agents selecting this designation knew they were creating prophetic irony that would define Nixon's presidency in ways no one could anticipate, or simply picked something that sounded appropriately presidential from the approved list of phonetically distinct options, the documentation doesn't definitively reveal, but Searchlight would become darkly, almost impossibly perfect within 5 years, transforming from operational necessity into accidental metaphor that seemed too symbolically precise to be mere coincidence. Service protocols by 1969 had evolved dramatically from the chaotic improvisation of the immediate post-Kennedy period. Codenames were now absolutely mandatory for all protectees, consistently enforced across all radio communications without exception, and permanently documented in central registries maintained at service headquarters in Washington. Nixon's detail used Searchlight in every transmission from his first day in office, and the president himself seemed largely indifferent to the designation during his early months in power. He was intensely focused on extracting America from Vietnam through peace with honor, opening diplomatic relations with Communist China, pursuing Tente with the Soviet Union, and establishing the foreign policy legacy he believed would define his presidency and secure his place in history. His family received the S prefix according to established protocol that was now enforced without deviation. Pat Nixon became Starlight, a romantic counterpart that matched her husband's theme while maintaining separate identity appropriate to the First Lady role she'd reluctantly accepted after decades of political partnership that had often felt more like obligation than choice. Service memos note that Pat accepted the designation without comment or apparent interest, treating it as one more element of presidential life she'd learned to endure with public grace, while maintaining private reservations about the costs of political ambition. Their daughters Tricia and Julie received Sugarfoot and Sundance respectively, names reflecting their youth, and the service's ongoing attempts to assign something pleasant and age-appropriate to people who hadn't asked to live under constant protection, but had no choice in the matter, given their father's position. The Nixon family codenames followed all established patterns, creating no operational challenges and raising no questions during the selection process. The logbook from Nixon's early presidency shows entirely unremarkable patterns that gave no hint of coming catastrophe. Searchlight appeared in routine radio traffic, coordinating presidential movements between the White House, Camp David, Key Biscayne, and San Clemente, where Nixon had established what critics called the Western White House. Agents used the designation consistently during domestic policy meetings, foreign diplomatic sessions, and the massive anti-war demonstrations that continued to challenge Nixon's promise of achieving peace with honor in Vietnam. Nothing about the codename suggested the scandal that would eventually consume his administration, destroy his presidency, and transform his designation from functional operational security into symbol of the investigative apparatus that would illuminate his crimes. That transformation began quietly on June 17, 1972, when 5 men working for Nixon's re-election campaign broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate office complex in Washington. They were arrested by District of Columbia police carrying burglary tools, cameras, and electronic surveillance equipment. The break-in should have been a relatively minor scandal, easily contained through standard political damage control and strategic lies. Instead, it triggered an investigation that would shine literal and metaphorical searchlights into every dark corner of the Nixon administration, exposing a comprehensive pattern of criminal activity that extended far beyond one botched burglary. The service continued using Searchlight throughout the unfolding scandal without any apparent awareness of the symbolic irony or any consideration of changing the designation. Radio discipline required absolute consistency. Changing a president's codename mid-administration would create operational confusion, complicate agent training across multiple protection details, and undermine the standardization that had been implemented after Dallas specifically to prevent security failures through inconsistent procedures. So, Searchlight persisted with bureaucratic inevitability as journalists investigated, prosecutors pursued evidence, and congressional committees began examining the administration's systematic attempts to cover up White House involvement in the break-in and subsequent obstruction of justice. By early 1973, as the scandal metastasized through revelations about hush money payments to the burglars, witness tampering, obstruction of justice, abuse of federal agencies for political purposes, and illegal domestic surveillance programs, Nixon's codename acquired meaning the service had never intended and could never have predicted. The Washington Post's relentless investigation by reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, supported by the mysterious source Deep Throat, who provided crucial guidance from inside the federal bureaucracy, was literally shining searchlights on presidential misconduct. The Senate Watergate Committee, chaired by North Carolina Senator Sam Ervin, and broadcast on national television throughout the summer of 1973, methodically illuminated criminal behavior that reached directly into the Oval Office itself. Journalists covering Watergate began explicitly referencing Searchlight in articles about the investigation, recognizing the accidental perfection of Nixon's codename and unable to resist the symbolic resonance. The word became journalistic shorthand for the intense scrutiny the president faced as prosecutors, congressional investigators, and relentless press coverage turned investigative attention on someone who'd spent his entire political career operating in shadows, making backroom deals, maintaining enemies lists, and viewing politics as warfare requiring any tactics that might produce victory regardless of legal or ethical constraints. The service's internal communications from this period, preserved in archives and released decades later through Freedom of Information Act requests, show agents discussing the code-name situation with dark humor that reflected their awareness of the irony. Some memos note explicitly that they were protecting someone called Searchlight, who was being systematically exposed by actual searchlights. But operational protocols prevented them from changing the designation regardless of symbolic appropriateness. Searchlight was Nixon's code name. It would remain Nixon's code name until he left office or died, following regulations that didn't allow for modifications based on political circumstances or reputational considerations. The scandal deepened relentlessly throughout 1973 and into 1974. The revelation that White House tape recording systems had documented Oval Office conversations provided potential evidence of Nixon's direct involvement in the cover-up. When Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox subpoenaed those tapes, Nixon ordered his firing in what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre, a constitutional crisis that triggered widespread calls for impeachment. Attorney General Elliot Richardson and Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus both resigned rather than carry out Nixon's order. Solicitor General Robert Bork finally executed the firing, but the political damage was catastrophic and irreversible. Searchlight appeared in service radio traffic throughout these constitutional crises, agents coordinating Nixon's movements during desperate meetings with congressional leaders, protecting him during increasingly rare public appearances where protesters demanded his resignation, tracking him through Camp David weekends, where he brooded over his collapsing support and considered various strategies for political survival. The codename persisted with professional consistency, while the presidency it designated fell apart under an investigative illumination that exposed criminality extending throughout the administration. The Supreme Court's unanimous decision in United States v. Nixon, issued in July 1974, ordered the president to release tape recordings that proved his personal involvement in the cover-up. Chief Justice Warren Burger, whom Nixon himself had appointed to lead the court, wrote the opinion that destroyed Nixon's last defense. The tapes revealed Nixon had ordered the CIA to stop the FBI's investigation of Watergate just days after the break-in. Clear evidence of obstruction of justice that made impeachment inevitable and conviction virtually certain. Nixon resigned on August 8, 1974, rather than face certain impeachment by the House and probable conviction by the Senate. His final address to the nation, delivered from the Oval Office at 9 o'clock Eastern Time, announced his decision to leave office at noon the following day. Throughout those final 48 hours, as moving trucks loaded Nixon family belongings and staff members wept in West Wing offices, service agents continued using Searchlight over radio to coordinate the ex-president's movements through his final hours in power. Searchlight remained Nixon's designation for life, following service regulations for former presidents. The code name persisted through his post-presidential years, through his gradual rehabilitation as elder statesman on foreign policy, through the final illness that killed him in April 1994. 20 years after his resignation, Nixon was still Searchlight in service communications, still carrying the designation that had accidentally predicted his destruction through illumination of crimes he'd tried desperately to hide in darkness. Gerald Ford became president without anyone voting for him, inheriting both Richard Nixon's office and the nearly impossible burden of restoring credibility to an institution Nixon had systematically corrupted through criminal behavior and constitutional contempt. When Nixon resigned in August 1974, Ford stepped into the presidency carrying the weight of two unprecedented circumstances that would define everything about his brief time in power. He was the only person ever to become vice president through the 25th Amendment's appointment process, rather than election, and the only person to then become president without ever appearing on a national ticket as either presidential or vice presidential candidate. The Secret Service assigned him passkey, and the designation revealed everything about his role, his limitations, and the strange constitutional moment that elevated a fundamentally decent man into power he'd never particularly sought or expected to wield. Service archives reveal that Ford had initially requested something different during the chaotic transition period immediately following Nixon's resignation. Documents released through subsequent Freedom of Information Act requests show Ford wanted steady, a straightforward designation that emphasized stability, reliability, and his well-earned reputation as a solid, unflappable presence during 25 years representing Michigan's 5th Congressional District in the House of Representatives. The name would have announced his clear intention to provide calm governance after Watergate's chaos, to restore normalcy through dependable leadership that avoided Nixon's paranoia and criminality, to demonstrate that American democracy could survive its worst crisis since the Civil War through. Constitutional procedures and institutional resilience. Steady captured exactly how Ford understood his role, and what he believed the nation needed from him during this impossible transition. The service rejected steady on technical grounds that had nothing to do with symbolic appropriateness. Protection protocols required absolute phonetic distinctiveness between all active code names to prevent confusion during radio communications, especially in crisis situations when multiple protectees might be moving simultaneously through complex environments where clarity could mean the difference between effective protection and catastrophic failure. According to service memos from August 1974, steady sounded too similar to existing codenames then in active use for other protected individuals. The exact conflicts aren't specified in declassified documents, but the phonetic overlap was deemed operationally unacceptable under mandatory standards. Passkey was offered as an alternative that maintained similar connotations while meeting technical requirements for phonetic clarity that couldn't be compromised. The name suggested access, unlocking, and the administrative function of opening doors that had been jammed closed by Nixon's criminality and the constitutional crisis his behavior had created. Service documentation indicates the selection committee believed passkey captured Ford's actual role with surprising precision. He was providing access to functioning government after Watergate had paralyzed the executive branch, unlocking constitutional mechanisms that had been corrupted by Nixon's systematic abuses. Ford accepted the change without complaint, extended negotiation, or any apparent concern about the symbolic implications of accepting a codename he hadn't chosen. He'd spent his entire political career as a team player, someone who followed established procedures and didn't create unnecessary friction over matters he considered peripheral to actual governing. If the Secret Service wanted passkey instead of steady, Ford would use passkey and immediately move on to vastly more important concerns, like preventing economic collapse, managing the chaotic end of American involvement in Vietnam, and deciding whether to pardon Richard Nixon for crimes that hadn't yet been formally charged. This deference became its own revelation about Ford's essential character and his relationship with presidential authority. Here was someone whose codename had been imposed rather than chosen, who'd accepted bureaucratic override without pushing back or demanding the designation he'd originally requested, who treated the codename as administrative detail rather than identity marker or symbolic statement about his presidency. The logbook documented not just the name, but Ford's fundamental nature. Someone genuinely comfortable serving rather than commanding, following established procedures rather than imposing his will, accepting rather than demanding. Passkey fit his actual constitutional function with precision that seemed almost too perfect to be accidental. Ford had literally unlocked the government after Watergate paralyzed it. His ascension to the presidency, however constitutionally proper under the 25th Amendment, was fundamentally about providing access to governance when the alternative was prolonged constitutional crisis that might have damaged American democratic institutions beyond any possibility of repair. Whether the service agents selecting his codename understood this symbolic resonance, or simply got bureaucratically lucky with their technical choice, the documentation leaves deliberately ambiguous. His wife Betty took a dramatically different approach to the codename selection process, revealing personality and approach to power that contrasted sharply with her husband's deferential acceptance. When the service asked about her preferences, she selected Pinafore herself, quickly and decisively, without the extended deliberation her husband had shown before accepting the service's imposed alternative. The name referenced her background in dance with Martha Graham's company and her continuing interest in fashion, pursuits that had preceded her reluctant entry into political life as a congressional wife, that had survived her years as second lady, and that she was determined to maintain even as. She assumed the First Lady role during circumstances no one had anticipated or prepared for. Service memos from August 1974 note Betty Ford's decisiveness during the codename discussion, her clear understanding that these designations were simultaneously trivial operational details and revealing symbolic statements about identity and autonomy. She grasped intuitively what her husband seemed not to consider particularly important, that codenames mattered as markers of independence and self-definition. Selecting Pinafore herself maintained a small but psychologically important sphere of personal control in a life that was being utterly transformed by her husband's unexpected elevation to power. She was establishing boundaries, claiming identity, announcing that some aspects of her existence remained her own, even as she assumed a public role she'd never wanted and had actively dreaded for decades. Pinafore didn't match Paskey alphabetically, breaking the pattern that had been rigidly established under Johnson and consistently followed through Nixon without any deviation. The service noted this discrepancy in internal communications, but made the deliberate decision not to enforce the alphabetical matching rule that had become standard protocol for presidential families. Betty Ford's selection was honored without modification, and her independence became part of the permanent administrative record preserved in the logbook. Decades later, historians studying her advocacy for women's autonomy, her unprecedented openness about her mastectomy, her outspoken support for the Equal Rights Amendment, and her willingness to discuss controversial topics like abortion rights and premarital sex would find early evidence of that. Fierce independence and a codename choice made during her first weeks as First Lady. The Ford children received assigned names following the P pattern that grouped them with their father: Professor for Michael, Pac-Man for Jack, Panda for Stephen, and Peaches for Susan. These designations were selected by the service without family input, reflecting standard practice for younger family members who hadn't specifically requested names. The pattern grouped them with their father while acknowledging Betty's separate trajectory, creating a family codename structure that accidentally documented the power dynamics and relationship patterns within the Ford household with surprising accuracy. Ford's presidency began with his September 8, 1974 decision to pardon Richard Nixon for all crimes committed during his presidency, a controversial move that shocked the nation and destroyed Ford's initial honeymoon period with press and public. Paskey appeared in service radio traffic throughout the political firestorm that followed, agents coordinating Ford's movements during press conferences where he patiently defended the pardon, protecting him during public appearances where protesters accused him of corrupt bargaining with Nixon, tracking him through congressional testimony where he insisted under oath that no deal had been struck in exchange for Nixon's resignation. When Ford left office in January 1977, after losing to Jimmy Carter, Paskey shifted to permanent archive status. The name documented 29 months when the President of the United States had provided temporary access to restore governmental function, then been replaced once that function was restored. Jimmy Carter arrived in January 1977, carrying promises to restore honesty to government and a codename that would capture both his moral authority and his fundamental limitations as a leader operating in a political environment that didn't particularly reward moral clarity. The service assigned him deacon, a designation that referenced his Southern Baptist faith, his well-documented background teaching Sunday school in Plains, Georgia, and his carefully cultivated image as a Washington outsider who would bring spiritual integrity and ethical governance to a capital. Still traumatized by Nixon's criminality and disgusted by Ford's controversial pardon that many Americans interpreted as corrupt bargaining, Carter accepted Deakin without requesting alternatives or engaging in extended deliberation about symbolic implications, apparently viewing the codename selection as one more administrative detail in the overwhelming transition to power that would test every assumption he held about governance, leadership, and the relationship between moral righteousness and political effectiveness. The designation fit his public identity with almost uncomfortable precision, emphasizing spiritual authority, moral teaching, commitment to higher principles, and service to values that transcended mere political expediency or partisan advantage. Service records from Carter's presidency show consistent use of Deakin in all radio communications from his first day in office through his final departure in January 1981 after losing re-election to Ronald Reagan. Agents found the name operationally appropriate according to all established criteria, phonetically distinct from other active codenames, appropriately dignified for presidential protection. Easy to employ in the rapid-fire communications that coordinated movements and ensured security. Carter himself rarely mentioned his codename publicly during his presidency or in the decades of post-presidential activity that followed, treating it as functional necessity rather than symbolic statement worth discussing or analyzing. This public indifference mirrored his general discomfort with the theatrical elements of presidential power, his consistent preference for substance over style, his genuine belief that good policy implemented through competent administration mattered far more than effective performance or skilled. Media manipulation. Carter wanted to govern, not to perform governance. Deakin fit this approach perfectly, suggesting someone focused on teaching, serving, and upholding principles rather than someone obsessed with image management or political theater. His wife Rosalind received dancer, maintaining the alphabetical D pattern that had been established as absolute standard protocol, while suggesting grace, partnership, and the kind of fluid movement that would characterize her surprisingly active role in the administration. Unlike previous First Ladies, who'd maintain more traditional distance from policy discussions and decision-making processes, Rosalind Carter sat in on cabinet meetings as a full participant, traveled abroad as presidential envoy with genuine authority, and functioned as trusted advisor on both. Domestic and foreign policy matters. Dancer suggested elegant performance and aesthetic grace, but the reality behind the designation involved substantial governing authority that made her one of the most powerful and politically engaged First Ladies in modern American history. Their daughter Amy, 9 years old when Carter took office, received Dynamo, a name capturing childhood energy and constant motion while fitting the family's designated initial. Service records show agents struggled throughout Carter's presidency with the operational challenges of protecting a child whose parents wanted her to have genuinely normal experiences despite living in the White House. They'd made the controversial decision to enroll her in public school in Washington rather than the private institutions typically chosen by presidential families seeking to insulate their children from excessive public attention. Dynamo appeared in radio traffic coordinating movements between school, the White House residence, and various activities that attempted to balance Amy's childhood normalcy against the inescapable reality that she was growing up under constant Secret Service protection. Carter's presidency struggled from the beginning with challenges that moral clarity and spiritual conviction couldn't adequately address or solve. The energy crisis, triggered by OPEC oil embargoes and America's dangerous dependence on foreign petroleum, created gas lines that stretched for blocks, economic stagnation that persisted despite various policy interventions, and a widespread sense that American power was declining in ways that threatened the nation's global position and domestic prosperity. Stagflation, the economically devastating combination of inflation and economic stagnation that defied traditional Keynesian solutions, persisted despite Carter's attempts to address it through various policy mechanisms. Carter's attempt to address these interconnected challenges through appeals to sacrifice, conservation, and what he characterized as necessary limits to American consumption patterns, most famously articulated in his July 1979 televised address that critics labeled the malaise speech, though. Carter never used that specific word, struck many Americans as defeatist rather than inspiring, as admitting defeat rather than rallying the nation toward solutions. Deacon appeared in service radio traffic during this period, coordinating Carter's movements as he attempted to lead through moral exhortation that increasingly seemed inadequate for the scale of challenges facing the nation. The code name acquired increasingly ironic connotations as Carter's presidency unfolded, and his limitations became more apparent to both political observers and ordinary voters. The designation suggested spiritual leadership, moral authority deriving from religious conviction, someone who could guide congregations through preaching and personal example. But deacons serve rather than lead in church hierarchies. They support pastors rather than commanding congregations. They teach Sunday school to children rather than making hard decisions about resource allocation, military intervention, or political combat with opponents who don't share their moral assumptions or respect their religious convictions. Carter's codename accidentally captured his fundamental limitation as president. He wanted to be morally right more than he wanted to win political battles, to serve faithfully according to his understanding of Christian principles, rather than to command effectively in ways that required moral compromise or strategic deception. Deacon documented this gap between spiritual authority and political effectiveness, between what Carter believed leadership should involve and what actual governance required in practice. The Iran hostage crisis, beginning in November 1979 when Iranian revolutionaries seized the American embassy in Tehran and held 52 Americans captive, came to define Carter's presidency and expose the painful gap between moral clarity and effective exercise of power. Deacon appeared in service radio traffic throughout the 444-day ordeal as agents coordinated Carter's movements during endless National Security Council meetings, protected him during increasingly desperate diplomatic efforts that went nowhere, tracked him through the catastrophic failure of a military rescue mission in April 1980 that killed 8 American service members and further humiliated the United States on the global stage. Carter's deep religious faith, which had seemed like considerable strength during his 1976 campaign against Ford, became a liability as the hostage crisis dragged on without resolution. His reluctance to use overwhelming military force against Iran despite considerable domestic pressure to do so, his persistent commitment to negotiation and diplomatic solution, even when those approaches proved ineffective, his belief that patient moral consistency would eventually prevail all. Of these impulses reflected the Deacon identity, but proved tragically inadequate for dealing with a revolutionary government that viewed American power as satanic corruption deserving of deliberate humiliation. When Carter left office in January 1981 after Reagan's landslide victory, Deacon became his permanent designation for life. But Carter's post-presidency transformed the codename from apparent liability into eventual vindication. He built houses with Habitat for Humanity, demonstrating commitment to service through actual manual labor. He founded the Carter Center, working on disease eradication and conflict resolution. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002. He became the longest-lived president in American history. Deacon aged remarkably well, describing a post-presidential career that validated what the designation had always suggested: someone called to serve rather than to command. Someone whose moral authority derived from actions rather than position. Ronald Reagan arrived in January 1981, carrying Hollywood in his bones and understanding that presidency was performance art, requiring the perfect codename to match his carefully constructed persona. He'd been shot just 69 days into his presidency during an assassination attempt outside the Washington Hilton that left him inches from death and permanently altered how the Secret Service approached his protection. When it came to his codename selection, Reagan had been absolutely specific about what he wanted from the moment the service asked for his preferences. He chose Rawhide, and the designation was approved immediately without objection or modification. Rawhide was pure theatrical performance translated into operational security designation. Reagan had spent his pre-political career as an actor in Hollywood, including memorable roles in Western films, where he'd played cowboys and frontier heroes embodying idealized American masculinity. The codename extended that carefully cultivated persona directly into the presidency, suggesting toughness, frontier individualism, and the romanticized American West that Reagan genuinely believed represented the nation's true character and historical destiny. It was identity as conscious performance, which made perfect sense for someone who'd always understood that politics was fundamentally theater requiring skilled actors who could make audiences believe in the roles they played. Service records show that Reagan genuinely delighted in rawhide throughout his 8 years in office. Agents who served on his detailed report and oral histories that he occasionally joked about the designation, asking whether his code name made him sound sufficiently tough and heroic, whether it captured the image he wanted to project as the oldest president ever elected taking office at age 60. 9. The assassination attempt in March 1981, when John Hinckley Jr. fired 6 shots outside the Washington Hilton and 1 bullet ricocheted into Reagan's chest, only reinforced the cowboy imagery that rawhide was meant to evoke. Reagan had been shot, but had walked into George Washington University Hospital joking with doctors, telling his wife Nancy, "Honey, I forgot to duck," and asking the surgical team, "Please tell me, you're all Republicans." The rawhide persona, tough, unflappable, quick with a one-liner even in crisis, became his defining characteristic both during the assassination attempt and throughout his presidency. Whether this was authentic Reagan or skilled performance barely mattered. The codename documented how he wanted to be understood, and he lived up to that designation with remarkable consistency. Nancy Reagan received Rainbow, a carefully controlled choice that emphasized optimism while maintaining the R alphabetical pattern. The name fit her public image as a protective, glamorous first lady devoted to her husband's success and legacy, though it deliberately obscured her significant behind-the-scenes influence on administration policy, personnel decisions, and scheduling that gave her power far beyond what Rainbow might suggest. Both code names supported carefully constructed public identities, Reagan as tough cowboy, Nancy as supportive optimist, while reality involved more complex power dynamics. The service's internal communications from the Reagan years, later obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, reveal agents' concerns about the president's Hollywood mentality and how it affected security operations. Some memos noted that Reagan sometimes seemed more focused on how situations would play publicly than on actual security protocols that agents considered essential for his protection. His insistence on rawhide was cited as evidence of this theatrical approach to the presidency. He wanted the code name that told the best story, that reinforced the image he'd spent decades constructing, regardless of whether it served any operational purpose beyond the standard security requirements any code name would fulfill. But rawhide worked precisely because Reagan understood narrative power better than any president since Franklin Roosevelt. His presidency relied fundamentally on projecting strength, confidence, and American exceptionalism that would restore national pride after the humiliations of Vietnam, Watergate, and Carter's perceived weakness. The codename reinforced those themes every single time agents used it over radio frequencies. Whether discussing his location, coordinating motorcade movements, or tracking his position during public events, rawhide reminded everyone involved that this president saw himself as a Western hero, restoring American greatness through force of personality and clarity of vision. The name aged remarkably well throughout Reagan's 2 terms, never acquiring the ironic overtones that had haunted Johnson's Volunteer or Nixon's Searchlight. He survived the assassination attempt and returned to full presidential duties. He presided over economic recovery following the severe recession of 1981-1982. He negotiated arms control agreements with Soviet leaders while maintaining military pressure that arguably contributed to the Soviet Union's eventual collapse. He left office in January 1989 with approval ratings above 50% despite the Iran-Contra scandal that had shadowed his final years and raised serious questions about his knowledge of illegal arms sales and fund diversions. Rawhide never became ironic because Reagan had picked a code name and then lived up to it, at least in public perception that mattered more than complex reality. He'd played cowboy convincingly enough that most Americans accepted the performance as authentic leadership. Whether Reagan himself understood the difference between performance and authenticity, whether he consciously manipulated public perception, or simply became the role he'd chosen to play, remained questions that historians would debate for decades. The logbook didn't answer those questions. It simply preserved Rawhide as documentation of what Reagan wanted to be, and how successfully he'd performed that chosen identity. When Reagan left office in January 1989, Rawhide remained his designation throughout the post-presidential years. The codename outlasted his presidency, his post-political career, and eventually his memory as Alzheimer's disease progressively erased the man who'd played cowboy so convincingly that he'd transformed American politics. But in the logbook, Rawhide preserved the performance indefinitely, a president who'd understood that choosing the right codename meant choosing the right story, and that the story mattered more than complex reality behind it. The service preserved Rawhide in the permanent archive as documentation of a presidency built on performance, image management, and the understanding that in modern media-saturated politics, perception often mattered more than policy substance. Reagan had grasped this fundamental truth better than his predecessors. His codename selection demonstrated that understanding from the very beginning. He'd picked Rawhide because he knew exactly what story he wanted to tell about himself and his presidency. The logbook documented that choice, and the 8 years when the story Reagan wanted to tell became the story most Americans believed. George Herbert Walker Bush took office in January 1989 with a service-assigned codename that suggested predatory instincts beneath patrician polish and carried the weight of dynasty expectations that would define both his presidency and his family's continuing grip on American political power. The service assigned him Timberwolf, a designation that emphasized both the wilderness of his claimed Maine roots and something fundamentally predatory beneath his carefully cultivated public image as the ultimate Washington insider. The Connecticut wasp who'd transformed himself into a Texas. Oilman before climbing every rung of the Republican establishment ladder, Bush accepted Timberwolf without public complaint. Those service memos indicate he'd initially preferred something referencing his genuine Navy service during World War II, when he'd been the youngest aviator in the service and had been shot down over the Pacific. The service rejected naval-themed options on grounds they'd been overused in previous administrations or created phonetic confusion with other active code names. Timberwolf was offered as an alternative that captured wilderness associations while maintaining appropriate presidential dignity and meeting all technical requirements for phonetic distinctiveness. The designation was neutral, but accidentally revealing in ways that would become apparent only as Bush's presidency unfolded. The name carried associations with pack animals, territorial instincts, and survival through adaptation to different environments, qualities that described Bush's political career with uncomfortable accuracy. He'd been a congressman, UN ambassador, Republican National Committee chairman, envoy to China, CIA director, and vice president before winning the presidency. He'd survived politically by adapting to different institutional environments, understanding hierarchies, and knowing when to follow rather than lead. Timberwolves operated exactly the same way, succeeding through pack behavior and environmental adaptation rather than individual dominance. His wife Barbara received Tranquility, a name that emphasized her calm, grandmotherly public persona, while maintaining the T alphabetical pattern now enforced without exception. The designation suggested peaceful serenity, someone who provided ballast and stability for her husband's political ambitions. But Tranquility masked steel beneath the pearls and white hair. Barbara Bush was politically astute, fiercely protective of her family's dynasty ambitions, and willing to criticize opponents publicly when she judged it necessary. The codename documented the performance, while reality involved someone far more formidable than the gentle designation suggested. Their children, now adults with their own political careers emerging or already established, received service protection in codenames when circumstances required it. George W. Bush, already governor of Texas by his father's inauguration, had carried the childhood designation Tumbler during the vice presidential years. Jeb Bush would eventually receive Tripper when he became Florida governor. The Bush family's codenames weren't just protecting current officials, they were documenting a political family whose children and grandchildren would eventually require their own Secret Service details, creating a logbook record of American aristocracy accumulating power across generations. The service files from Bush's presidency show something the earlier logbook entries hadn't explicitly documented with such clarity: dynastic assumptions embedded directly into the naming system itself. The Bush family's codenames weren't merely protecting individuals currently holding office or serving in vulnerable positions. They were tracking a political family that spanned generations and assumed continued access to power as birthright, rather than as achievement earned through each generation's independent efforts. The logbook was documenting American democracy's creation of its own hereditary political class. Bush's single term as president demonstrated both his considerable strengths in foreign policy and his debilitating weaknesses in domestic politics. He managed the end of the Cold War with impressive skill, navigating Soviet collapse without triumphalism that might have provoked dangerous instability. He built an international coalition to reverse Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, demonstrating diplomatic abilities that his predecessor Reagan had never possessed. He maintained steady governance through tumultuous global change that could easily have spiraled into chaos under less experienced leadership. But Timberwolf revealed his limitations as clearly as it captured his survival instincts. Bush struggled to connect with voters domestically, appearing confused by everyday items like grocery store scanners that ordinary Americans dealt with constantly. He famously promised "read my lips," no new taxes during his 1988 campaign, then broke that promise in a 1990 budget deal that probably represented responsible governance, but politically destroyed his credibility with conservative base voters, who would never forgive the betrayal. He seemed genuinely puzzled that Americans cared more about their economic struggles than about foreign policy achievements he considered far more significant. The predatory connotations of Timberwolf seemed increasingly inappropriate for someone so fundamentally decent, restrained, and committed to traditional notions of public service over personal aggrandizement. Bush wasn't a wolf in any meaningful sense. He was a Connecticut patrician who'd tried to prove his toughness through various poses. Texas oilman, CIA director, Cold War president, but who'd ultimately lost to Bill Clinton, someone who felt voters' pain more convincingly and promised economic focus that Bush's foreign policy expertise couldn't match. Timberwolf appeared in service radio traffic during Bush's failed 1992 re-election campaign, coordinating his movements through rallies that never generated Clinton's energy, tracking him through debates where he was caught checking his watch as if bored by domestic policy discussions, protecting him during the final weeks when defeat became increasingly inevitable. The codename persisted through his concession and his gracious departure from office, maintaining the dignity and institutional respect that Bush valued more than political victory. The more interesting revelation from the Bush presidency came from the dynasty pattern now fully visible in the logbook. When Bush left office in January 1993, his son, George W., already occupied the Texas governor's mansion, having won election in 1994. Another son, Jeb, would become Florida governor in 1999. The Bush family's codenames, Timberwolf for the father, Tumbler then Trailblazer for the eldest son, Tripper for the younger son, documented a political family that spanned generations and assumed continued access to the highest levels of American power. The service's logbook wasn't just recording individual presidencies anymore. It was documenting political dynasties, family ambitions, and the ways American democracy had created its own version of aristocracy, despite constitutional prohibitions against inherited titles. The codenames revealed succession planning that extended beyond single terms or individual careers. They showed families that understood power as patrimony, as something passed from father to sons, rather than as something earned independently by each generation. Bush's Timberwolf designation remained his until his death in November 2018 at age 94. By then, the irony was complete and impossible to ignore. He'd been president, yes, but history would remember him primarily as the father of another president and the patriarch of a political dynasty that had produced governors, senators, and presidential candidates across multiple generations. The predatory wolf connotations of his codename had never fit his actual character, but Timberwolf as pack leader, as alpha male establishing dynasty, that interpretation fit perfectly in retrospect. The logbook preserved his designation as documentation of how American political families accumulated and transferred power across generations, creating hereditary advantages that contradicted democratic theory while remaining perfectly legal under constitutional structures. Timberwolf sat in the archive as evidence that some codenames revealed truths their selectors hadn't intended, but that became undeniable once sufficient time provided historical perspective. Bill Clinton arrived in January 1993 with carefully considered, strategically calculated preferences about his codename that revealed his sophisticated understanding of image management, symbolic politics, and the enormous gap between private behavior and public performance that would come to define his presidency and eventually bring him to the brink of removal from office. According to service records preserved through multiple Freedom of Information Act requests and archived in the National Archives, Clinton specifically requested Eagle, a traditional designation that suggested soaring American power, visionary leadership rising above partisan conflict, and the kind of presidential gravitas that Clinton desperately wanted to project despite persistent, nagging questions about his character, his avoidance of Vietnam service through various student deferments, and manipulation of the draft system, and the increasingly credible rumors about his personal life that had nearly derailed his campaign multiple times. The service approved Eagle without objection or modification, and the code name became Clinton's official designation for 8 tumultuous years that would be marked by extraordinary legislative battles, remarkable economic success that produced budget surpluses for the first time in decades, Republican congressional victories in the 1994 midterm elections that gave the GOP control of Congress for the first time in 40 years, and personal scandals that culminated in impeachment proceedings, testing whether private sexual misconduct and perjury constituted sufficient grounds for removing a president who remained stubbornly popular with voters, despite behavior that appalled millions of Americans. The name revealed Clinton's acute awareness of image management imperatives and his determination to associate himself with traditional presidential authority and timeless American symbolism, despite the character issues that would haunt his entire time in office and eventually threaten his political survival. The choice was explicitly designed to elevate him above the persistent controversies that had followed him from Arkansas, to frame him as someone embodying presidential power and American ideals despite his draft record that suggested cowardice or at minimum a willingness to manipulate the system. For personal advantage, despite the Jennifer Flowers allegations that had nearly destroyed his candidacy when she claimed a 12-year affair and released tape recordings of phone conversations, despite his carefully parsed admission that he'd experimented with marijuana during his time at Oxford, but famously didn't inhale in ways that suggested evasiveness and dishonesty rather than the candor he was claiming, despite persistent questions about various Arkansas business dealings, including the Whitewater land development that would eventually consume years of investigation. Eagle was designed to make people think of soaring American ideals, of presidential vision and authority, rather than of the personal weaknesses and character flaws that Clinton's opponents would relentlessly, obsessively highlight throughout his presidency. Hillary Rodham Clinton received Evergreen, a designation she selected herself according to service documentation, and the choice was perhaps the most ambitious, prophetic, and revealing First Lady codename selection in the logbook's entire history spanning decades of presidential families. The name suggested permanence across changing seasons, resilience through difficult circumstances, vitality that would persist regardless of political fortune, and the ability to remain politically relevant and powerful long after conventional political careers would have ended. It was an extraordinarily revealing choice for someone whose political ambitions clearly extended far beyond her role as First Lady, someone who intended to use the position as launching pad for her own career rather than as endpoint or culmination of her political involvement. Evergreen announced explicitly, for anyone paying attention to symbolic signals, that Hillary Clinton intended to remain politically vital, active, and influential for decades after her husband's presidency ended, that she saw herself as independent political actor rather than as mere supportive. Extension of Bill's career or traditional First Lady performing ceremonial duties. The name would prove remarkably, almost eerily prophetic over the following quarter century. She'd win election to the Senate representing New York in 2000 before Bill had even left office. Run competitively for president herself in 2008 before losing narrowly to Barack Obama, serve as secretary of state under Obama from 2009 to 2013, and run for president again in 2016 as the Democratic nominee. Evergreen was a promise made in early 1993 that Hillary would spend the next 3 decades systematically fulfilling through relentless political activity that outlasted and eventually overshadowed her husband's legacy. The alphabetical E pattern grouped Bill and Hillary while acknowledging fundamentally separate trajectories and independent ambitions that would become more apparent as their relationship evolved through scandal, political calculation, and the complex partnership that allowed them to survive. Together, what might have destroyed most marriages. Their daughter Chelsea, 13 years old when Clinton took office, received energy, a name that fit both the mandatory E pattern and her youth, while suggesting the vitality and constant motion that would characterize her adolescence spent under unprecedented media scrutiny. The service followed standard protocol for presidential children, attempting to balance stringent protection requirements with Chelsea's desperate need for some approximation of normal adolescent development despite growing up in the White House during what would become the most scandal-plagued presidency since Nixon's resignation and disgrace. Clinton's presidency was turbulent and controversial from the moment he took office in January 1993. His first term brought the catastrophic healthcare reform failure when Hillary's comprehensive plan, developed in secret by a task force that excluded congressional input, collapsed spectacularly under sustained Republican opposition and fierce insurance industry resistance that successfully portrayed the plan as government overreach. The 1994 midterm elections gave Republicans control of both House and Senate for the first time since 1954, a devastating repudiation that Newt Gingrich and other Republican leaders interpreted as mandate to block Clinton's agenda and position themselves for recapturing the presidency. Constant controversies about Clinton's past, the Whitewater real estate dealings that spawned a special prosecutor investigation lasting years, the Paula Jones sexual harassment lawsuit alleging misconduct when Clinton was Arkansas governor, the suicide of Deputy White House counsel Vince Foster, that conspiracy theorists absurdly claimed was murder, the Travelgate controversy over White House travel office firings, dominated news coverage and overshadowed genuine policy achievements including deficit reduction that eventually produced budget surpluses, welfare reform that fundamentally restructured anti-poverty programs, and economic growth that created millions of jobs. Eagle persisted through all of this chaos and controversy, appearing constantly in service radio traffic that coordinated presidential movements through triumph and humiliation, legislative success and personal scandal, economic achievement and character questions. The codename remained absolutely constant, while Clinton's reputation fluctuated wildly between impressively competent governance and reckless personal behavior, between genuine political skills that allowed him to outmaneuver Republican opponents and character weaknesses that seemed to confirm everything his harshest critics had always said about him. The Monica Lewinsky scandal, which broke in January 1998 when news organizations reported that independent counsel Kenneth Starr was investigating whether Clinton had committed perjury and obstruction of justice to conceal a sexual relationship with a White House intern less than half his age, transformed Eagle into darkly ironic, almost painful commentary on the gap between presidential aspiration and actual behavior. Here was a president whose codename suggested soaring American ideals and visionary leadership rising above partisan conflict, who was instead mired in absolutely sordid details about Oval Office sexual encounters, semen-stained dresses, cigar usage that couldn't be described in family newspapers, and systematic lying under oath to conceal behavior that violated every norm of presidential dignity. Congressional testimony during the impeachment proceedings that consumed the final 2 years of Clinton's presidency included numerous references to Eagle and Secret Service logs and communications. Agents had used the code name throughout the entire period when Clinton's behavior had violated every standard of presidential dignity, constitutional responsibility, and personal morality. The House impeachment managers prosecuting the case against Clinton in the Senate trial repeatedly referenced service documentation that tracked Eagle during the time period when the president was engaging in sexual encounters with an intern young enough to be his daughter. The contrast between Eagle and the reality of Clinton's behavior became the subject of editorial cartoons, late-night comedy monologues, and biting political commentary that treated the codename as unintentional joke or cosmic irony. How could someone called Eagle, a name suggesting majesty, power, and the ability to soar above earthly concerns, be caught in such tawdry, embarrassing circumstances? How could a designation meant to suggest American ideals and presidential dignity become permanently associated with behavior that humiliated the nation and damaged the office's credibility in ways that would take years to repair? Eagle was supposed to protect through operational obscurity, to hide Clinton's identity from potential threats. Instead, it highlighted and amplified the yawning gap between Clinton's aspirations and his actual conduct, between the president he wanted to be and the flawed, reckless person he actually was. Clinton survived impeachment through a combination of strong economic performance, public exhaustion with the investigation, and partisan calculation, was acquitted by the Senate in February 1999, and left office in January 2001, with approval ratings still relatively high despite the scandals that had consumed his presidency and nearly destroyed his political legacy. His economic record was genuinely impressive by almost any measure: budget surpluses, historically low unemployment, technological boom driven by internet expansion, rising wages for workers across income levels. But Eagle remained permanently tainted by the scandals, by the systematic lies, by the recognition that Clinton had desperately wanted a codename suggesting majesty and vision, but had instead provided 8 years of personal behavior that contradicted and mocked everything the designation was meant to represent. The service documentation from Clinton's lengthy and active post-presidency shows that his team requested his codename remain active longer than was typical for former presidents, citing his continued high public profile, his extensive international travel on behalf of the Clinton Foundation, his lucrative speaking career, and his ongoing role in Democratic politics that persisted long after leaving office and extended into active campaigning for Hillary during her presidential runs. Eagle continued appearing in service communications for years, tracking someone who transitioned from active president to historical figure, someone whose code name would forever be associated with both genuine political talent and spectacular personal failures, with policy success and moral catastrophe. When historians eventually assess Clinton's presidency with the distance that time provides, Eagle will serve as convenient shorthand for the profound contradictions that defined his time in office and his entire political career. George Walker Bush became president in January 2001 after the most contested, controversial, and legally disputed election in modern American history, and his codename told a comprehensive story about dynasty expectations, desperate psychological need to establish distance from his father's shadow, and the profound weight of carrying a family name that connected him inescapably to the previous Bush presidency, while simultaneously trying to prove he was his own man. The election itself had been decided by the Supreme Court rather than by clear popular mandate, with the court's 5-4 decision in Bush v. Gore stopping the Florida recount and effectively awarding him the presidency despite losing the national popular vote by over 500,000 ballots. The service assigned him Trailblazer, marking a deliberate and psychologically revealing shift from the Tumbler designation he'd carried as a child during his father's vice presidency under Reagan, and then during his father's single presidential term. Service memos document explicitly that Bush's transition team participated actively in the selection process and made clear requests about what they wanted the code name to communicate. They explicitly requested a designation that wouldn't echo his father's Timberwolf pattern, that would suggest independence and new direction rather than continuation of previous Bush policies or simple extension of family legacy into a second generation. They wanted something that emphasized Bush's determination to be his own president, to forge his own path distinct from his father's approach, to create his own legacy rather than simply completing his father's unfinished business or correcting what Republicans viewed as his father's political mistakes. The service approved Trailblazer as meeting all these symbolic requirements, while also satisfying technical operational needs for phonetic distinctiveness that prevented confusion with other active code names in simultaneous use. The designation revealed everything about Bush's complicated, fraught psychological relationship with family legacy and paternal shadow that had defined his entire adult life. He'd spent decades as the wayward son, drinking heavily until age 40 when he quit completely, failing at multiple business ventures that were rescued by family connections, living aimlessly through his 30s without clear purpose or direction until his religious conversion and marriage too. Laura Welch provided structure, purpose, and the motivation to transform himself. His unlikely political career, first as Texas governor and then as president, represented deliberate reinvention, conscious decision to succeed where his father had failed politically, and to avoid the weaknesses that had cost George H.W. Bush re-election in 1992. Trailblazer announced publicly what Bush needed desperately to believe privately, that he was forging entirely new paths rather than following his father's established trails, that he was his own man with his own vision rather than simply the son trying to vindicate the father's reputation. Whether that claim was actually true mattered less to Bush than his psychological need to assert it, to make it part of his identity, to have it documented in the permanent record that future historians would examine when assessing his presidency. The service documented this performance without editorial comment, preserving Trailblazer as evidence of generational anxiety embedded directly into codename selection, as proof that even operational security designations could become psychological battlegrounds where family dynamics played out. Through bureaucratic procedures, Laura Bush received Tempo, a name suggesting rhythm, careful pacing, measured approach, and her deliberately low-key, traditional approach to the First Lady role. She had absolutely no interest in the aggressive policy activism that had characterized Hillary Clinton's controversial tenure, preferring instead to focus on education advocacy and literacy promotion while maintaining clear separation between ceremonial First Lady duties and actual governing decisions. Tempo fit this measured approach perfectly, suggesting someone who understood the importance of appropriate pacing and who had no desire to generate the kind of controversies that had plagued her predecessor. Their twin daughters, Barbara and Jenna, received Turquoise and Twinkle respectively when they aged into requiring full Secret Service protection during their father's presidency. The Bush family maintained the strict T initial pattern that had become absolutely mandatory protocol, while carefully avoiding any code names that would directly echo the father's administration or create explicit associations with Timberwolf. The family structure revealed dynasty continuation alongside psychological assertions of independence that may or may not have reflected genuine autonomy from paternal influence. Bush's presidency during his first 8 months was relatively unremarkable, focused primarily on domestic policy priorities, including education reform and the massive tax cuts that would contribute to ballooning federal deficits. He seemed uncertain about foreign policy, uncomfortable with international affairs, content to delegate most overseas concerns to experienced advisors, while he focused on the domestic agenda he actually cared about and understood. Trailblazer during this early period seemed almost ironic. He wasn't blazing any trails. He was following conventional Republican priorities and governing cautiously. Everything changed on September 11th, 2001. When terrorists hijacked 4 commercial aircraft and successfully attacked the World Trade Center and Pentagon 8 months into his first term, killing nearly 3,000 people in the deadliest terrorist attack in American history, Trailblazer acquired entirely new meaning virtually overnight. The president who'd been trailing his father's legacy, whose legitimacy had been questioned because of the controversial election, whose authority had seemed tenuous, suddenly had to blaze actual trails through unprecedented crisis that no previous president had faced. His decisions in the days, weeks, and months after 9/11, the invasion of Afghanistan to destroy al-Qaeda's safe haven and overthrow the Taliban government that had harbored them. The dramatic expansion of executive power through the USA Patriot Act, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, the authorization of enhanced interrogation techniques that clearly constituted torture under international law, the establishment of military detention facilities at Guantanamo Bay, and ultimately the catastrophic decision to invade Iraq represented genuine departure from his father's notably more cautious, multilateral approach to foreign policy and international intervention. Trailblazer fit the post-9/11 Bush far better than it had fit the uncertain, domestically focused president of early 2001. He was indeed forging new paths. Though whether those paths led anywhere Americans ultimately wanted to go became increasingly and bitterly contested as his presidency unfolded and the consequences of his decisions became apparent. The Iraq War, launched in March 2003, based on intelligence assessments about weapons of mass destruction and connections to al-Qaeda that proved catastrophically, comprehensively wrong, turned into prolonged, bloody occupation that defined Bush's presidency more than any other single decision. The initial military victory was swift, Baghdad fell within weeks, Saddam Hussein was captured, and Bush delivered his infamous mission accomplished speech aboard an aircraft carrier in May 2003. But actual mission was just beginning, and it would consume thousands of American lives, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives, trillions of dollars, and America's international credibility. Service records from the Bush years show Trailblazer used with perfect consistency through 2 complete terms, through 9/11 and its aftermath, through the Afghanistan and Iraq wars that continued throughout his entire presidency, through Hurricane Katrina's devastating destruction of New Orleans, and the administration's shockingly inadequate response that revealed fundamental governmental incompetence, through the 2008 financial crisis that destroyed the economy during Bush's final months in office, and required massive government intervention to prevent complete economic collapse. The codename persisted without variation while Bush's public approval ratings collapsed from post-9/11 highs above 90%, the highest ever recorded for any president, to historic lows below 30% by the end of his second term. The trails he'd blazed with such confidence after 9/11 had led to quagmires in Afghanistan and Iraq, to massive federal debt from unfunded wars and tax cuts, to damaged international relationships and diminished American credibility, to torture scandals and constitutional controversies, to economic disaster. When Bush left office in January 2009, handing power to Barack Obama, who'd campaigned explicitly on repudiating Bush's policies and approach, Trailblazer shifted to permanent archive status as documentation of 8 years of genuine independence from his father's path and governing philosophy. Bush had indeed been his own president, had made his own catastrophic decisions based on his own flawed judgment, had owned his own failures rather than simply repeating his father's mistakes or following his father's more cautious instincts. The dynasty pattern persisted throughout and beyond his presidency. The Bush family remained extraordinarily powerful in Republican politics, with Jeb Bush eventually running for president himself in 2016, though he was destroyed during the primaries by Donald Trump's vicious attacks on the Bush family legacy. But George W. had at least avoided being merely his father's shadow, or his father's second term. He'd created his own presidency, forged his own path, blazed his own trails into disaster. The logbook preserved Trailblazer as comprehensive evidence of someone who'd gotten exactly what the codename suggested, just absolutely not in ways he'd hoped or intended when his transition team had requested it in late 2000. He'd wanted to trailblaze toward conservative policy achievements, constitutional government, compassionate conservatism that addressed poverty while respecting market principles, and strong, decisive leadership that would secure his place in history as successful president independent of his father's record. Instead, he'd blazed trails toward military quagmires that consumed thousands of lives and trillions of dollars without achieving stated objectives, toward constitutional controversies about torture and surveillance that damaged America's moral standing, toward economic collapse that required government intervention on a scale not seen since the Great Depression. The codename documented both his aspiration for independence from paternal influence and the reality that independence from his father's path didn't remotely guarantee success on his own terms or vindication of his own judgment. Barack Obama faced the codename selection in November 2008, knowing that whatever he chose would carry weight and symbolic meaning that no previous president had borne. Because he was the first black president in American history, and every decision he made, including something as seemingly operational as a Secret Service codename, would be scrutinized for symbolic significance, cultural meaning, and what it revealed about how he understood his own historic role. His victory had come after a campaign that shattered assumptions about American racial politics, defeating both the Clinton dynasty in the primaries and John McCain in the general election. According to service archives preserved through multiple Freedom of Information Act requests, Obama selected Renegade, and the choice was absolutely deliberate, carefully considered, and psychologically revealing about how he understood both his unprecedented position and the transformative potential of his presidency. Renegade suggested rebellion, rule-breaking, and someone who operated outside established norms and conventional expectations. The word carried connotations of someone who rejected orthodoxy, who refused to be constrained by traditional boundaries, who represented fundamental challenge to existing power structures. For a senator who'd served less than 4 years in Washington before winning the presidency, who'd overcome the formidable Clinton political machine and racial barriers that had prevented any black candidate from seriously contending for the office throughout American history, the name fit with remarkable precision. Obama understood that he represented fundamental disruption to the existing political order, that his very presence in the Oval Office challenged deeply embedded assumptions about who could hold power in America and what presidential authority looked like. Renegade announced he wasn't trying to hide that disruption or minimize its significance through reassuring gestures toward continuity. He was embracing it, claiming it, making it central to his political identity. The choice revealed sophisticated understanding of symbolic politics and the importance of framing his presidency on his own terms from the very beginning. Obama wasn't going to let others define what his historic election meant. He was defining it himself through a code name that suggested revolutionary change rather than incremental progress. The service's internal memos, later obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests and preserved in National Archives holdings, reveal significant concern about Obama's choice among some agents and administrators responsible for his protection. Multiple memos noted that Renegade carried connotations of someone who didn't follow established rules, who broke from accepted practice, who couldn't be easily controlled or predicted in ways that made security planning more complicated. For a protective detail responsible for keeping alive the first black president in a nation with a long history of racial violence and political assassination, these weren't abstract concerns or merely symbolic worries. Some internal communications expressed worry that the name suggested dangerous unpredictability, or someone who might actively resist security protocols that agents considered absolutely essential for his protection. The concerns weren't entirely unfounded. Obama was known for wanting more direct contact with crowds than his security detail preferred, for occasionally pushing back against restrictions he found excessive, for maintaining a public accessibility that sometimes conflicted with optimal protection. Procedures, renegades seemed to announce these tendencies, rather than to suggest someone who would defer to Secret Service expertise without question. But the service ultimately approved the selection because they recognized they had no legitimate operational grounds for rejection based solely on symbolic concerns. Obama had won the election decisively. He had every right to choose his code name within the technical parameters established by protection protocols. Renegade met all phonetic distinctiveness requirements that prevented confusion with other active designations. It didn't create operational problems beyond the symbolic associations that made some agents uncomfortable. The concerns about what the name suggested weren't sufficient reason to override a president-elect's explicit preference, especially when that president-elect was making history simply by existing and had every right to frame his own identity without bureaucratic interference. Michelle Obama selected Renaissance, a designation that paired brilliantly with renegade to suggest comprehensive cultural transformation rather than simple political change or routine partisan transition. The name emphasized rebirth, intellectual sophistication, artistic flowering, and the broader civilizational shift the Obamas represented beyond mere electoral victory or policy preferences. Michelle's choice revealed that she understood her role as fundamentally about reimagining possibilities, about demonstrating excellence that challenged stereotypes, about representing a vision of American identity that had been systematically excluded from presidential power throughout the nation's entire history. Renaissance was ambitious, aspirational, and confident in ways that announced Michelle Obama's refusal to be constrained by traditional First Lady expectations. She wasn't going to be decorative accompaniment or supportive spouse performing traditional gender roles. She was going to be a force for cultural transformation in her own right. The codename documented that intention from the first moment, creating permanent record of how she understood her historic position. The alphabetical R pattern grouped Barack and Michelle while maintaining the separate identities appropriate to their genuine partnership and mutual respect. Their daughters Malia and Sasha received Radiance and Rosebud respectively, names reflecting their youth, and the service's ongoing attempt to provide age-appropriate designations for children who'd spend crucial formative years under constant protection while their father made history and faced opposition that sometimes included racist attacks on the entire family. The Obama family's codenames told a coherent story about representation, change, excellence, and the enormous burden of being first. Obama's presidency fulfilled some of Renegade's promise while disappointing those who'd expected more revolutionary transformation of American politics and society. He passed the Affordable Care Act in March 2010, extending health insurance coverage to millions of Americans and achieving comprehensive health care reform that had eluded Democratic presidents for decades, despite repeated attempts. The legislation represented genuinely renegade accomplishment, breaking through Republican opposition, insurance industry resistance, and political obstacles that had defeated better-positioned predecessors. He ordered the Navy SEAL raid that killed Osama bin Laden in May 2011, fulfilling the unfinished mission from the Bush years, and demonstrating decisive use of military force, despite his reputation among critics as weak on national security. He normalized diplomatic relations with Cuba, ending 50 years of Cold War-era isolation that no longer served American interests. He negotiated the Iran nuclear deal, using diplomacy rather than military confrontation to address proliferation concerns. He appointed 2 Supreme Court justices, including the first Latina justice. These were genuinely renegade moves, breaking from established policy patterns despite fierce opposition from entrenched interests. But Renegade also highlighted Obama's limitations and the growing gap between the revolutionary change his supporters had anticipated during the euphoric 2008 campaign and the pragmatic incrementalism he actually delivered, once confronting the realities of governing. He struggled throughout 8 years to work effectively with Republican opposition that refused to grant him basic legitimacy as president. The birther conspiracy, promoted by Donald Trump and others who claimed Obama wasn't born in the United States and therefore wasn't constitutionally eligible for the presidency, represented racist denial of his legitimacy that persisted despite overwhelming documentary evidence. Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell announced in 2010 that his top priority was making Obama a one-term president, subordinating all other policy considerations to the goal of denying him re-election. Congressional Republicans opposed Obama's initiatives reflexively, regardless of their policy merit, even blocking proposals they'd previously supported when advocated by Republicans. This obstruction made governing extraordinarily difficult and prevented the transformative change Renegade seemed to promise. His attempts to close the Guantanamo Bay detention facility failed when Congress blocked funding for transfers and prohibited bringing detainees to the United States for trial. His immigration reforms stalled in Congress and eventually required executive actions that Republicans challenged as unconstitutional overreach. His response to the Syrian civil war was cautious and restrained rather than bold, reflecting genuine policy constraints, but disappointing those who'd expected more decisive action against Assad's brutality. The president, called Renegade, often governed carefully, constrained by political reality, institutional resistance, and the recognition that revolutionary rhetoric couldn't overcome structural obstacles. Renegade became a lightning rod throughout Obama's 8 years in office. Conservative media frequently referenced the code name as evidence of Obama's supposed radicalism, his alleged disrespect for American traditions, his outsider status that critics weaponized as proof he didn't truly belong in the presidency. Fox News commentators and Republican politicians used Renegade to suggest Obama was governing outside constitutional bounds, that he viewed himself as above the law, that his presidency represented dangerous departure from American values. The codename Obama had chosen to signal transformative change became rhetorical ammunition for those who opposed that change and who saw his presidency as fundamental threat to their vision of America. Whether Obama anticipated this weaponization when he selected Renegade in November 2008, the service files don't indicate. But the choice revealed his willingness to embrace rather than minimize the revolutionary nature of his presidency. His understanding that being the first black president meant disrupting established patterns regardless of how carefully or cautiously he actually governed. Throughout 8 years, Renegade appeared in service radio traffic coordinating presidential movements through triumph and crisis, through legislative victories and defeats, through his surprisingly comfortable 2012 re-election victory over Mitt Romney, and through his final term as a lame duck. Watching his potential successor, the codename persisted through the rise of Donald Trump as his successor, a candidacy and eventual presidency that represented explicit reaction against everything Obama's presidency had symbolized and achieved. Whatever disruption Obama had represented, American politics proved that more disruption, more extreme, more chaotic, more destructive of established norms, was coming in direct response. Trump's candidacy gained momentum partly through racist birther conspiracy theories about Obama's legitimacy. His campaign promised to repeal the Affordable Care Act and reverse Obama's policies, animated Republican voters who viewed the previous 8 years as disaster requiring correction. Renegade had disrupted the existing order. Trump promised to disrupt the disruption. When Obama left office in January 2017, Renegade became his permanent designation for the rest of his life following standard service protocols. The name documented 8 years when a black family had occupied the White House for the first time in American history, when healthcare reform had finally passed despite decades of failure, when America had elected someone who'd seemed impossible just years before his emergence. Whether Obama had been renegade enough for his supporters who'd expected revolutionary change, or too renegade for his opponents who'd never accepted his legitimacy, the logbook didn't judge. It simply preserved the name he'd chosen and the presidency it represented. Renegade sat in the permanent archive as documentation of both transformative achievement and frustrated ambition, of barriers broken and limits discovered, of someone who disrupted the existing order while finding that disruption alone couldn't overcome all the structural obstacles to the change he'd promised. The service maintained Renegade as evidence of how codenames could capture both aspiration and limitation simultaneously, both the revolutionary potential of a historic presidency and the institutional constraints that prevented full realization of that potential. Obama had chosen rebellion when offered the chance to frame his own identity. The service had written down that choice and documented 8 years of governance that proved rebellion was necessary but insufficient for transformation. History would continue debating whether the rebellion had succeeded on its own terms or whether it had simply provoked the counter-revolution that immediately followed. Donald Trump became president in January 2017 with a code name that surprised absolutely no one who knew anything about him: his decades of shameless self-promotion, or his understanding of presidential power as natural extension of personal branding and wealth accumulation that had defined his entire public existence. He selected Mogul, and the service approved it immediately because the designation met all technical requirements for phonetic distinctiveness and operational clarity, while perfectly capturing Trump's self-image, his business background, and his determination to treat the presidency as another vehicle for brand extension, media attention, and the kind of ego gratification that had motivated every major decision throughout his 70 years of life. The name was self-aggrandizing, completely obvious, and quintessentially Trump in ways that made subtlety, dignity, or traditional presidential restraint utterly irrelevant considerations. Mogul wasn't subtle and made no pretense of being anything other than what it was: a declaration of dominance, wealth, power, and the kind of outsized ego that required constant affirmation and public recognition. The word itself suggested someone who controlled industries, who made deals that shaped markets, who accumulated wealth and wielded it as instrument of power. Trump had spent decades building an elaborate brand around his surname, systematically turning Trump into shorthand for luxury, success, and aspirational wealth that allowed middle-class Americans to fantasize about lives they'd never actually lead. Mogul extended that carefully constructed branding directly into the presidency, treating what should have been a purely operational Secret Service designation as yet another marketing opportunity and identity projection tool. Service records indicate Trump was deeply and personally involved in the codename selection process from the very beginning of his chaotic transition, far more engaged with this symbolic detail than with many of the substantive policy briefings his team was receiving. Unlike previous presidents who'd either accepted service assignments with minimal input or made modest requests within understood parameters of appropriateness and dignity, Trump had strong opinions about his designation from day one, and wasn't remotely shy about expressing them to anyone who would listen. He reportedly considered several different options before settling on Mogul, wanting a name that projected strength, business acumen, and the deal-making prowess he claimed as his defining characteristic despite a business record that included 6 bankruptcies and numerous failed ventures. The service documented his insistence on the final choice and his evident satisfaction once Mogul received official approval. Internal memos note that Trump seemed pleased with himself for selecting a code name that reinforced his public image rather than creating new associations or suggesting qualities he didn't already claim. Unlike Obama's Renegade, which had suggested transformation and disruption, Trump's Mogul simply amplified what he'd already spent decades telling anyone who would listen: that he was a brilliant businessman whose success qualified him for any position including the presidency. Melania Trump received Muse, a designation assigned by the service rather than selected by her according to all available documentation. The name suggested artistic inspiration, aesthetic beauty, and decorative accompaniment while maintaining the mandatory M alphabetical pattern. Whether Melania appreciated the designation, found it reductive and objectifying, or simply didn't care enough to request an alternative, she never commented publicly during Trump's presidency or in the years that followed. Her codename reflected exactly how Trump's presidency would treat her throughout 4 turbulent years, as beautiful visual accompaniment to his dominating presence rather than as independent figure with her own political identity, substantive policy role, or meaningful influence beyond. Appearance management and occasional ceremonial functions. Their son Baron received Mountaineer, a name that fit both the required M pattern and his remarkable height, which was notable even during adolescence and became the subject of occasional media commentary. The Trump family's codenames told a straightforward story about branding priorities, ego management, and the ways Trump approached absolutely everything, including operational security protocols designed to protect his life, as opportunities for self-promotion, identity projection, and reinforcement of the public image he'd spent decades cultivating. Trump's presidency was absolute chaos from the beginning, characterized by unprecedented staff turnover that saw senior advisors departing after mere months or weeks, constant Twitter controversies that dominated news cycles and distracted from actual governance, 2 impeachment proceedings, the Mueller investigation into Russian election interference, destructive trade wars that damaged American farmers and manufacturers, and eventually the COVID-19 pandemic that would define his final year in office, kill over 400,000 Americans on his watch, and contribute significantly to his 2020 electoral defeat. Mogul appeared in service radio traffic, coordinating Trump's movements through constant crisis, protecting someone whose approach to the presidency violated virtually every established norm of behavior, institutional respect, and constitutional understanding, while somehow remaining just barely within legal bounds most of the time. Agents coordinated his protection during rallies where he encouraged violence against protesters, during international summits where he insulted traditional allies, during visits to military cemeteries where he reportedly called fallen soldiers losers and suckers during the catastrophic pandemic. Response that saw him suggesting people inject bleach and take unproven medications. The irony of Mogul became increasingly and painfully apparent as Trump's business empire faced mounting scrutiny from investigators, journalists, and congressional committees that revealed foundations built far more on debt, tax avoidance, and questionable dealings than on the success story Trump had spent decades promoting through his books, his television show, and his presidential campaign. Congressional investigations exposed elaborate tax avoidance schemes that were technically legal, but ethically reprehensible, showing a businessman who'd paid just $750 in federal income taxes during his first year as president. Financial records subpoenaed by prosecutors and eventually obtained by the New York Times showed a business record far more complicated and troubled than Trump's self-mythologizing had ever suggested. He'd lost more money than almost any other American taxpayer during the 1980s and 1990s according to EAR's data. His businesses had declared bankruptcy 6 times. His wealth appeared to derive more from licensing his name to other developers than from his own business acumen. The president who'd chosen a codename explicitly about business dominance was actually deeply in debt, dependent on loans from sources he wouldn't fully disclose, and running businesses that appeared to violate constitutional emoluments clauses prohibiting presidents from profiting from their office. Service testimony during Trump's first impeachment in 2019 included numerous references to Mogul. Agents had coordinated security during the Ukraine scandal that led to his impeachment for abuse of power and obstruction of Congress when he attempted to extort a foreign government into investigating his political opponent Joe Biden. The codename appeared in radio traffic during the trial itself, protecting a president who would become only the 3rd in American history to be impeached, though he was ultimately acquitted by the Republican-controlled Senate. The codename appeared again with even more disturbing frequency during the January 6, 2021 Capitol riot, when Trump's supporters violently attacked Congress in an attempted insurrection designed to prevent certification of Biden's electoral victory. Service agents had to evacuate Vice President Mike Pence to secure locations while Trump watched the violence unfold on television from the White House dining room and reportedly resisted urgent calls from advisors, family members, and congressional leaders to tell his supporters to stand down and leave the Capitol. Mogul appeared in service communications coordinating Trump's movements during those terrible hours when American democracy came closest to violent overthrow since the Civil War. The codename documented a president who'd incited the violence through months of lies about election fraud, who'd told his supporters to fight like hell during a rally that morning, who'd then refused to stop the violence for hours while his own vice president's life was in danger and members of Congress were hiding in fear. Throughout 4 years, Mogul documented a presidency that broke nearly every norm of behavior, institutional respect, and constitutional understanding. It tracked someone who treated government as extension of his personal business interests, who viewed the office as branding opportunity rather than as public trust, who appointed family members to senior positions despite their complete lack of qualifications, who fired anyone who showed insufficient personal loyalty, who openly profited from the presidency by directing government business to his properties. The codename Trump had selected to project business success became comprehensive documentation of how he'd approached presidential power as something to be exploited for personal benefit, media attention, and ego gratification, rather than as something demanding selfless service, institutional respect, or concern for anything beyond his own immediate interests. Trump lost re-election to Joe Biden in November 2020, receiving 7 million fewer popular votes and losing the Electoral College by the same margin he'd won by 4 years earlier. But he refused to concede, spending 2 months making increasingly desperate and evidence-free claims about election fraud that culminated in the January 6 insurrection. When he finally left office in January 2021, refusing to attend Biden's inauguration in a final break with 2 centuries of tradition, Mogul became his permanent designation under service protocols. The name documented 4 years of norm-breaking, scandal, corruption, and a presidency that had treated the office exactly as Trump treated everything else in his life, as brand extension, wealth accumulation opportunity, and platform for the endless ego gratification that seemed to be his primary motivation for seeking power in the first place. For once, the codename was absolutely perfect in ways that revealed uncomfortable truth rather than aspiration or self-deception. Trump had wanted Mogul to suggest business success, deal-making genius, and the kind of wealth accumulation that proved his superiority to ordinary people who'd never achieved his level of success. The service had written it down without comment or judgment, and the presidency had revealed exactly what kind of mogul he actually was. Someone whose success was more performance than substance, whose empire was built on debt and branding rather than genuine business achievement, whose approach to power was fundamentally transactional and nakedly self-interested rather than remotely dedicated to public service, constitutional responsibility, or anything beyond his own immediate benefit. The logbook preserved Mogul as permanent documentation of what happens when someone treats the presidency as another business venture, as branding opportunity, as vehicle for personal enrichment. The codename sat in the archive as evidence that sometimes the names presidents choose reveal exactly who they are with uncomfortable precision. Joe Biden took office in January 2021 with a codename that deliberately rejected drama, consciously eschewed revolutionary rhetoric, and promised exactly what exhausted Americans desperately wanted after 4 years of relentless chaos and systematic norm breaking, a return to normalcy, baseline, competence, and predictable governance that didn't generate constant constitutional crises or produce daily scandals that dominated every news cycle. He selected Celtic, a straightforward, unpretentious reference to his Irish heritage and working-class Scranton roots that had defined his political identity and shaped his approach to governance throughout 5 decades in Washington. The service approved the choice without objection, complication, or extended deliberation about symbolic implications. After Trump's aggressively self-promotional mogul, Biden's Celtic felt like institutional relief, a return to codenames as operational designation, rather than as branding exercise, identity performance, or marketing opportunity. Celtic suggested tradition, heritage, ethnic identity, and authentic connection to working-class roots that had defined Biden's extraordinarily long political career since his unlikely 1972 Senate victory at age 29, when he'd overcome enormous odds to defeat an incumbent Republican in a traditionally conservative state. He'd spent nearly half a century in Washington representing Delaware, first in the Senate for 36 years, and then as vice president under Obama for 8 more, building relationships through personal connection, practicing an old-school political style based on handshakes and backroom negotiations, and cultivating an authentic working-class sensibility that sometimes veered into embarrassing verbal gaffes, but that generally served him remarkably well politically. The codename reflected Biden's fundamental comfort with being exactly who he was, without pretense or reinvention. An Irish Catholic from Pennsylvania who'd risen through Democratic politics by staying true to his roots, maintaining his Scranton accent and blue-collar affect, taking the train home to Delaware every night during his Senate years to be with his family, and never pretending to be anything other than a working-class kid who'd made good through politics. Celtic captured this identity completely, suggesting someone whose heritage and ethnic background weren't something to hide or transcend, but rather the foundation of his political appeal and personal authenticity. Jill Biden received Capri, a designation that maintained the mandatory C alphabetical pattern while suggesting Mediterranean warmth, vacation relaxation, and the academic sophistication appropriate to a First Lady who continued teaching English and writing courses at Northern Virginia Community College even while occupying the White House and performing ceremonial duties. The name was neutral, pleasant, professional, decidedly uncontroversial, and matched perfectly the Biden family's deliberate rejection of Trump-era spectacle, constant controversy, and the exhausting drama that had defined the previous 4 years. Everything about their codenames announced clearly and unmistakably, we're here to do the job competently and professionally, not to perform for cameras, generate content for social media outrage, or treat the presidency as reality television entertainment. Service memos from Biden's transition period in late 2020 and early 2021 show what multiple agents who'd served through previous administrations described as the easiest, most straightforward modern codename selection process on record. No special requests beyond the initial preference that Biden expressed early in the transition. No brand management concerns or image consulting about what the codename should communicate. No extended deliberation about symbolic implications or how the designation would be interpreted by supporters and opponents. Biden selected Celtic, Jill accepted Capri without requesting alternatives, and the service immediately moved on to the vastly more complex, urgent logistics of securing an inauguration during a deadly pandemic, and just 2 weeks after the January 6th Capitol riot that had tested every security assumption and revealed how vulnerable the democratic process actually was to violent disruption. Biden's presidency began under unprecedented circumstances that made Celtic seem almost absurdly, comically normal given the surrounding chaos. Trump had refused to concede the election despite losing by over 7 million popular votes, and the same electoral college margin by which he'd won in 2016. He'd spent 2 months making increasingly desperate and completely evidence-free claims about election fraud that culminated in the January 6th insurrection when his supporters violently attacked Congress in an attempt to prevent certification of Biden's victory. Trump had skipped the inauguration entirely, flying to Florida rather than participating in the peaceful transfer of power that had characterized American democracy for over 2 centuries. Biden took office with Washington transformed into an armed camp, with over 25,000 National Guard troops deployed throughout the city, with the Capitol still damaged from the riot, with razor wire and concrete barriers replacing the open access that had traditionally characterized inaugural ceremonies. Celtic appeared in service radio traffic, coordinating movements through this surreal, militarized landscape. A president trying desperately to restore normalcy and demonstrate that American democracy still functioned in circumstances that were anything but normal. The codename fit Biden's governing approach perfectly throughout his presidency. He emphasized competence over charisma, experience over innovation, steady experienced leadership over dramatic gestures or revolutionary rhetoric. Celtic didn't promise disruption, transformation, or fundamental change to American politics or society. It promised someone who knew intimately how government actually worked after 5 decades in Washington, and who would make it work again through patient, persistent application of institutional knowledge accumulated over an extraordinarily long career spanning multiple generations of American politics. Whether Americans wanted that stability and predictability, or found it boring and uninspiring, whether they appreciated experienced competence or craved more dramatic change, Biden was offering exactly what Celtic suggested: traditional, reliable, unflashy governance focused on getting concrete. Things done rather than on performing leadership for television cameras or generating viral social media moments. Biden's age became a defining issue that shadowed his entire presidency and raised persistent, increasingly urgent questions about his capacity to serve effectively and whether he should seek re-election. At 78, when inaugurated, he became the oldest president ever to take office, breaking the record previously held by Reagan. Questions about his mental acuity, his physical stamina and energy levels, his ability to serve a full 4-year term or run for re-election, and potentially serve until age 86 dominated media coverage and political analysis from both sympathetic and hostile sources. Celtic persisted through all of these concerns and controversies, service agents using the designation, whether Biden was delivering forceful State of the Union addresses that temporarily quieted doubts about his capacity, or struggling through press conferences where his verbal stumbles confused. Statements and occasional disorientation reinforced widespread concerns about age-related cognitive decline that his supporters dismissed as Republican talking points, but that many Democrats privately shared. The codename also highlighted and amplified the generational transition that was happening in American politics, whether Biden acknowledged it or wanted to confront it directly. He represented what was increasingly recognized as the last gasp of Cold War-era politics, of backroom Senate deals negotiated over drinks, of personal relationships across partisan divides that had characterized an earlier era of congressional governance. Celtic evoked an older Democratic Party, predominantly white, ethnic, working class, culturally moderate, that was rapidly giving way to younger, more diverse, more progressive leadership that would inevitably replace Biden's generation regardless of whether he chose to step aside voluntarily or tried to cling to power. He'd explicitly promised during his 2020 campaign to be a bridge to that next generation, to serve as transitional figure who would restore stability after Trump and then pass power to younger leaders better equipped for future challenges. Whether he'd actually fulfill that promise by declining to seek re-election, or whether he'd break it by running again despite his age remained uncertain throughout his first term, with Biden and his advisors sending contradictory signals that kept the question unresolved. Service records show Celtic used with perfect consistency through Biden's presidency, through his management of multiple overlapping crises that would have challenged any president regardless of age or experience. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic that had already killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. The chaotic, humiliating Afghanistan withdrawal in August 2021 that ended America's longest war but generated images of desperate Afghans falling from departing aircraft. Persistent inflation that reached 40-year highs and devastated family budgets despite strong employment numbers. Supreme Court controversies, including the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 that required sustained American support for Ukrainian resistance while avoiding direct military confrontation with a nuclear-armed power. Biden approached each challenge with the steady, experienced competence that Celtic suggested, scoring genuine legislative achievements including the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS Act supporting domestic semiconductor manufacturing, and significant climate change investments. His approval ratings stayed persistently underwater through much of his term despite these accomplishments, reflecting public frustration with inflation, immigration chaos at the southern border, and lingering doubts about whether someone his age should be president. The codename documented a presidency defined by attempting to restore normalcy and institutional function after Trump's 4 years of chaos. by trying to prove that traditional governance still worked in an era when many Americans had lost faith in institutions and democratic processes. Celtic suggested stability, tradition, connection to ethnic working class roots that had once formed the Democratic Party's electoral foundation. Whether that stability was sufficient for the moment's challenges, whether tradition could effectively address contemporary problems, remained open questions that Biden's presidency was still working to answer. The service continues using Celtic to coordinate protection for an aging president navigating extraordinarily complicated political circumstances, managing multiple simultaneous crises, and representing a generation of politicians whose time and power is clearly ending, whether gracefully or through forced retirement. The codename persists as Biden decides whether to seek re-election despite widespread concerns about his age, whether to step aside and allow younger Democrats to compete for the nomination, whether to remain Celtic through a second term that would see him serving until age 86, or to become former president, carrying the designation into retirement. The logbook will preserve whatever decision he ultimately makes, documenting whether Celtic represented brief interlude between Trump's chaos and whatever comes next in American politics, or whether Biden's traditional approach proved sufficient for restoring stability and demonstrating that competent, experienced governance still matters in American democracy. Either way, Celtic sits in the archive as evidence of what Americans wanted desperately in 2020. After 4 exhausting years, someone whose code name suggested normalcy, tradition, competence, and blessed relief from constant crisis, controversy, and chaos. Somewhere in a secure facility maintained by the United States Secret Service, the logbook waits for the next name. The archive has grown across 8 decades, documenting presidents from Truman through Biden, capturing how they saw themselves and revealing truths they didn't always intend to document. Each entry sits preserved indefinitely, protected as operational security record and historical artifact simultaneously. The names accumulate: Supervise, Providence, Lancer, Volunteer, Searchlight, Passkey, Deacon, Rawhide, Timberwolf, Eagle, Trailblazer, Renegade, Mogul, Celtic. The logbook doesn't judge. It doesn't distinguish between success and failure, between presidents who fulfilled their codename's promise and those who contradicted them through actual governance. It simply preserves what was chosen and what was assigned, creating a permanent record that reveals psychological patterns, generational anxieties, dynasty ambitions, and the gap between self-image and reality that defines presidential power. Someone will choose power, someone will choose humility, someone will choose wrong. The service will write it down. And decades later, historians will read between the lines and understand what the presidents didn't know they were confessing through names that seemed like operational security, but that actually documented truth about ego, insecurity, ambition, and the performance of authority that defines American democracy. The logbook remains, still being filled in, under lamplight, by agents who don't realize they're creating history. The archive grows with each administration, each family, each code name that will be analyzed and reinterpreted by future generations trying to understand how American power actually worked. If you made it this far tonight, thank you for listening to this journey through the Secret Service logbook and what it accidentally revealed about presidential psychology. Next time, we'll explore another forgotten corner of American political history. Until then, sleep well.